Hello, everyone. Well, it doesn't get much more tech talk than this doing it virtually this year with SIMA. I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and I hope you find the next 20 to 30 minutes to be very insightful. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of leveraging snowfall data, particularly following a lean winter. Some of you may have caught this webinar that we did back in May. This will be similar, but will provide a few additional points and concepts. I'll be leading the talk today. My name is Rob Reale. I'm the Director of Meteorological Services at WeatherWorks. I've been a part of SIMA for several years now, and in fact, back in 2017, led a SIMA workshop discussing the utilization of weather radar and technology. WeatherWorks has been a SIMA partner for over 15 years, and since 1986 has been the industry leader in providing weather information and consultation to the industry. And you may be familiar with products such as certified snowfall totals, storm alert forecasts, and snowtistics reports. As far as the outline goes, we'll start off with a recap of what happened in 2019-20 winter, and then we'll talk about why climatology suggests a likely bounce back. Also, we'll utilize snowfall climatology in regards to retaining clients, building contracts, and responding to RFPs. Last but not least, we'll discuss the importance of accounting for mixed precipitation events, being sure you get paid for the work that you do. As far as a 2019-2020 winter recap, well, the first thing that stands out to me, at least in this image, would be how much snow fell through the Rockies and through the northern part of the US, and how little fell as you went south and east. It really was a normal to above normal year through much of the Rockies and much of the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan. But as you went further south and east, the Ohio River Valley, and through much of the Northeast, particularly the 95 corridor, snowfall was lacking, to say the least. Here's a few numbers to kind of go with this as well. These were seasonal snowfall totals. You see close to 100 inches of snow up in Montana. Rapid City came in at 86.9, Fargo, Minneapolis, both around 50. Chicago is right around normal at about 35. But once you head to Columbus in Ohio, down under a foot of snow. Richmond, Newark, Boston, all well below normal. Even Erie at 67.6 inches of snow. It may not sound that bad for some, but for a snow belt right along the lake shore there, it was well below normal. And here's a departure from normal to kind of illustrate that further. You can see some of the blues to the north and west suggesting that it was a decent amount above normal in terms of seasonal snowfall last winter. A lot of grays to the central part of the US, indicating pretty much near normal snowfall, give or take a few inches. And then once you go to the East Coast, that's where snowfall amounts were as little as 10 to 30% of normal, particularly in this area highlighted here through the 95 corridor. And since we're going to talk about leveraging snowfall in lean winters, we're going to focus on particularly the Northeast and portions of the Midwest. So after looking at what happened last year, where it really was a poor winter for the eastern half of the US, we decided to put together a lean year climatology. What we did was we took the last 50 years of data, and then we selected the 10 leanest winters during that time and averaged them together. And that's what this ugly red line suggests right next to each of these cities. That's the average of the 10 worst or least snowy winters over the last 50 years. So for instance, in Albany, the 10 least snowy winters averaged to about 25 inches. Places like New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Indianapolis, and St. Louis all averaged under 10 inches of snow in their lean years. But then we said, hey, it can't be this bad forever. Things have to get better. So what we did was we looked at the snowfall following that lean year, and we averaged each of those 10 winters together. And that's where we got this blue line that shoots up quite a bit and looks a lot more promising. Lastly, we said, okay, that's looking good. How does that compare to normal? And that's what this gray line represents. The gray line is the 50-year average for each of these locations during this time period. So what you see is that the blue line, the years averaged together, the year that follows those lean years, shoots up quite a bit and ends up being on average near to, if not above normal. So obviously looking at these averages, that blue line that we just talked about, a bounce back of near to above normal snowfall, at least is fairly likely the following season. At least it looks that way. However, as we'll discuss through this webinar, averages can be misleading. For instance, that blue line doesn't necessarily mean that you had 10 years of decent snowfall. It could be that 2 years were well above average and then you had 8 subpar ones. Average does not mean normal, so it can be a little bit misleading. In reality, after doing a little more data crunching, the following year after a lean winter is almost guaranteed to increase. It should at least get better. It's very likely to at least be 3/4 or greater of average, meaning that if you averaged 40 inches of snowfall, you're very likely to at least see 30 inches of snow or more the following year. But it's only about a coin flip to actually exceed average. If you want the raw numbers from those 10 locations all kind of blurred together, there's a 93% chance that the next season will increase. There's a 71% chance that the next season will see at least 3/4 of average, so basically get back to near or above normal. And then there's only a 43% chance to actually exceed average. And one thing I want to point out about average is the 43% may seem low, but in reality, that's actually pretty par for the course. So average, you would think, hey, half the time would be above average, half the time would be below average. That's not what the average means. That's what the median would be that halfway point. But the average, if you look at almost any location across the US, it's not true for everywhere, but for the most part it is. There's actually more below average winters than there are above average winters. In general, only 40 to 45% of the time does any specific location see an above average winter, leaving 55 to 60% of the time being below normal in terms of snowfall. So if you are planning and budgeting out your next 10 years, you might want to account for a high likelihood that 6 are below normal and 4 are above normal. So tying that back to this 43% chance to exceed average following a lean winter, that's pretty much par for the course. I'm not going to get into why that is too much right now, but we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go through this webinar. So obviously this data so far was really useful, and obviously more of it would be great. So we're going to touch on how you get this data and what other sources of data in climatology, snowfall data you should be looking at. So first off, what is the snowfall climatology, right? Let's backtrack just a moment. Essentially what it is historical snowfall data spanning years, decades, or in some instances over a century. With this data, you can determine snowfall averages, extremes, seasonal variability, event magnitude breakdown, and much more. If you're building a contract and trying to make a business plan, I can't stress how useful this data is. How do you determine what average is, what normal is, what are the maxes or the min, what's a lean winter year look like versus a heavy winter? All of that can be obtained through a snowfall climatology report. Publicly, you can obtain this through NOAA. However, it's generally limited to reporting airports, which may or may not be quality controlled. If you want higher resolution data, for instance, zip code specific data with your client's actual location in mind and has more detail, you're going to need to talk to a private weather service. For instance, WeatherWorks, we provide something called a snowtistics report. So how do we utilize snowfall climatology? Well, let's start with a really basic example. Here we have a 30-year snowfall climatology year by year plotted for Boston, Massachusetts, spanning from 1990-91 to 2018-19. 2019-20. First thing that pops out to me is, man, it is all over the place. It's up and down and up and down. It looks like your heart rate after a busy winter season. So how do we make sense of something that seemingly has no rhyme or reason? Well, a good starting point is to look at snowfall averages. And here we have on the left plotted a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, 15, and 30-year average snowfall. Depending on the period of record that you're looking at, the average fluctuates roughly from 35 to 50 inches of snow. A few things I want to point out about this data. In general, the longer the data sets you look at, the more truer representation of what average actually is, because what happens over a longer period of time is data becomes more normalized and smoothed out. And that's why you see the 15 and 30 year nearly identical at about 46, 47 inches of snowfall. So for Boston, that's a pretty true representation of what average actually is. With less data, you'll tend to see a little bit more anomalous activity going on because 1 or 2 high or low years influences the data that much more. So for instance, you see the 10-year jump up to 50 inches on average, largely on the heels of the record-setting 2014-15 winter where Boston saw 110 inches. Meanwhile, the 3 and the 5 years dipped down into the 30s as far as average snowfall, largely influenced from the last 2 lean winters. So a question that you may have is, okay, well, which data set, 3, 5, 10, 15, 30, should I be looking at? And the answer is it kind of depends on what you're looking for. In general, it's recommended to look at a longer data set if you want a truer representation of what you can expect average to be. That's where the 15 or the 30 year comes into play. But depending on what you're trying to get across with your client or maybe demonstrate certain things, it may be advantageous to show a higher average, like a 10-year in this example, or a lower average like the 5-year in this example. Sort of up to you. So now let's say, okay, we kind of determine what our average is for Boston roughly, and let's just pretend that it's somewhere between 30 and 50 inches, somewhere between the 3 and the 10-year. So what we did over here is we plotted that area in red, and then we highlighted each of the years that fell within that range. You'd be surprised, only 9 of the 30 years actually fell within that average range that we just determined. That's less than a third of the time. And that's pretty typical for most places across the US. A lot of times you only see a third to as little as a fifth of the time will snowfall be average, which means banking on average snowfall each year is probably not the way to go. And living year by year, there's a pretty good chance that you don't see normal snowfall. However, if you're looking over a longer period, that's where there's a better chance to end up closer to average. But year by year, there's a pretty low chance, somewhere between a third and a fifth, to actually see average snowfall. And meanwhile, you can encounter some maxes and mins in any given year. For instance, within the last 10 years alone, Boston has seen as much as 110 inches and as little as 10 inches of snow. That's a 100-inch difference that could happen year by year, which is almost impossible to account for. So the question is, are you fully covered for those maxes and mins? Are you covered for this were you covered this past lean winter? Will you be covered for the next one? And do you account for the fact that average only happens once every 3 or 4 or 5 years? So what I'm going to dive into now is a little bit more detailed report. This is a snowtistics report that we offer, and just kind of show you some of the different data that's out there that can be really useful when planning and budgeting and creating contracts. And also, these are specific to zip codes, not necessarily specific to airports. So let's say in Massachusetts, you're in Beverly or Lawrence or Worcester, you probably don't want to use Boston's airport data, you want more specific data. And the same thing, we're going to look at a Chicago example here, but if you're in Waukegan or DuPage, you probably don't want to use O'Hare or Midway's airport data because things change quite a bit. So these are at a zip code specific level across the entire US and has lots of useful data in it. I'm not going to go through everything because I know there's a lot of boring numbers on here, but I just want to show you what kind of data you can get, whether it's from us or another provider. So first off, the raw data on the left, yeah, it's kind of boring to look at, but a lot of good stuff. You see monthly breakdowns of snowfall as well as yearly breakdowns of snowfall. You see averages for each of those, as well as some medians as well. And we touched on median before as kind of being the true midpoint in the data. The average can be a little bit misleading since there are typically more below average winters than above average winters. Additionally, like we touched on in the last slide, picking an average number is very hit or miss, and more oftentimes you won't have average snowfall. So sometimes it's better to pick an average range, and even in that last example where we picked 35 to 50 inches as an average range, that still wasn't enough. Sometimes looking at one full standard deviation can be more useful. And one full standard deviation essentially means that 2/3 of the time the data is going to fall within that area. And that's what you see in this gray area on the top right. That's showing the range of standard deviation. It's a lot easier to plan for what happens 2/3 of the time as opposed to a quarter of the time. The last thing I want to point out in these snowtistics, which I think are useful regardless of if you're going to get a snowtistics or not, is getting event magnitude breakdown, seeing how often and how many events you have on average per year, and then further broken down by how many salting events you have, plowing events you have, and significant events you may have in any given year. Truly, that's going to be helpful for planning time and material and overall staffing and budgeting. So some main takeaways so far, and then we'll touch on these points a little bit further in just a minute or two. Most winters aren't average, so be careful building your business model around the norm. Snowfall amounts can and do significantly vary season to season, right? We saw those maxes and those mins. Are you prepared for a 50 or 70 or even 100-inch difference from year to year? Are you prepared that the norm only happens a couple times every 10 or 20 years, right? So balancing your contracts and your overall portfolio is one way to ensure consistent profitability. I'm by no means a snow and ice contract expert, but I've talked to many people who are. And a lot of them would suggest that some kind of balanced approach, whether that's a mix of seasonal and per inch contracts, or adding some clauses in there that kind of balance things out, is a very good way to go about making a business plan. Additionally, volatility will decrease when reviewing a longer period of data. So if you're living year by year, you're sort of swinging for the fences each time and almost running a sprint, I'm sorry. But if you're looking at a longer period of data and kind of in it for the long haul, in terms of like a marathon, your risk will decrease and your stability will increase. Furthermore, zip code specific data as well as event magnitude data breakdowns are critical, right? Fine tune your business model at a location specific budgeting. There's a good chance that your portfolio has a wide, diverse area of different amounts of snowfall, amounts of events per year, which is very important that you aren't just looking at the closest airport, you're actually getting data that's specific to those locations. And one thing we haven't touched on just yet, but we will towards the end, is that different precipitation types should be accounted for when building a contract. This will more accurately account for time and material and make sure that you get paid for your hard work. So the first bullet point that we had was most winters aren't average. And because that, when using a basic seasonal or per inch contract, there will oftentimes be a winner or loser. This is something that's discussed in the industry, particularly Phil Sexton's been bringing it up lately. And because most winters aren't average, most times contracts will be viewed as unfair for one side, which will increase the distrust and hurt the relationship, right? No one wants to be the loser, everyone wants to be the winner. I can tell you right now, for example, on the East Coast, in Boston as an example, after 2 down winters back to back, property managers with seasonal contracts are probably saying, hey, let's go to the per inch side, and vice versa from the contractor side, right? All that's going to do is hurt the relationships, and furthermore, it's going to make predicting revenue and budgets nearly impossible. So what are some potential solutions? Well, from a contract standpoint, creating fairer, more stable contracts is a great way to go about it. And from a portfolio standpoint, you can balance by diversification. So, right, you can mix up some of your overall contracts with per inch versus seasonal. You can add some clauses in there, like caps and refunds in the contracts. There's a lot of ways to get creative and help make a balanced approach, not just for your company, but for your client as well. And again, this all ties back to that fact that snowfall amounts can and do significantly vary season to season. So how do you account for that variability? How do you determine what's a good contract type? What's a cap and a refund that might be beneficial for your location? It all draws back to snowfall climatology and getting proper data. And when you come armed with that data and you educate your customer, that could be the finishing touch and the first step to a more balanced contract and overall balanced portfolio. You can incorporate the wide range of possibilities and what normal is in the contract. You can help balance those winners and losers and minimize risk for both parties. And again, a basic example of this is adding caps and refunds, which you can start to determine effectively by looking at a snowfall climatology. Regardless of the amount of snowfall that falls in a given season, as a business owner, the bottom line is you've got to make sure that you ensure you can achieve paying both your fixed cost, particularly in a lean winter, and your variable cost, particularly in a heavy winter. So demonstrate to your client the value added. You're not just doing work when it's snowing, right? You're doing a lot of preparation before, during, and after the season. So make sure that you're covered for both those lean, average, and heavy winters. Next up, the fact that volatility decreases when reviewing a longer period of data. So what I want to demonstrate here is a 30-year snowfall climatology, and we're going to look at year-by-year numbers versus 3-year rolling numbers versus 10-year rolling numbers. But we're going to start out with, in New York City, are these blue lines, which are year-by-year snowfalls, just like we saw in Boston, goes up and down and up and down. And over the last 30 years, New York City's seen as much as 75 inches of snow in any given season and as little as 5 inches of snow. So that's a 70-inch difference that can happen year to year, which is nearly impossible to plan for. So like we said before, the longer out the data set you look at, the smoother the data becomes, the more normalized it becomes, which in turn will help, if you're using that, help kind of smooth your plan and narrow down your window of possibilities. So if we look at the 3-year rolling average, which is the orange line that still goes up and down, but it's a lot less drastic. And over the last 30 years, the 3-year rolling average has gone as much as about 45 inches and as little as about 10 inches. So we've narrowed that window of possibility to a 35-inch range. We've halved it from year to year, which could be a 70-inch difference, to 35-inch difference. And furthermore, if we look at a 10-year rolling average, well, first off, we see a solid trend in New York City with a steady increase over the last 10 years. And we see that the range of possibilities has only fluctuated 20 inches between 20 and 40 inches. So is it easier to account for a 20-inch difference over the contract period or over the length of your portfolio plan? 20 inches, 35 inches, or 70 inches? Obviously, less is better. So while it's unlikely that a customer will ever agree to a 10-year contract, settling for a 3-year contract can benefit both sides. And regardless of the length, and despite the year-to-year volatility, keeping a consistent contract type with the client can help maintain a balance. You'll have higher confidence when budgeting, and it can increase the chance for a longer relationship. Next up, we'll talk about zip code specific data and why that's so crucial. I know I've brought it up a couple times, so I want to demonstrate why. And the first bullet point you see is that snowfall significantly varies from location to location, and this is especially true near large bodies of water or along terrain. So the East Coast, places like Boston, New York City, even towards the Great Lakes, up towards the Buffalo area, Chicago area, there can be quite a bit of differences in short mileage away from location to location. And especially over terrain areas through the Rockies, places like Denver, or even along the Appalachians, a 1,000-foot difference in elevation can be a huge difference in average snowfall. So don't just settle for the nearest airport data, settle for and make sure that you get location-specific data. And what we're going to demonstrate here is the difference between New York City, Caldwell, and West Milford, which is only about a 30-mile radius from each other, but snowfall varies quite a bit different. As you can see, the line graph above, the 3-year rolling average for each of these, New York City is generally the least snowy. Caldwell is similar, but a little bit more snowy. But by the time you get to West Milford, which not only is 30 miles away, it's about 1,000 feet higher in elevation, they average 20 to 30 inches more than New York City per year. Obviously, you don't want to use the same data in West Milford as New York City, and you probably don't want to use the same in Caldwell as New York City either. And furthermore, if you have a report that can include event magnitude breakdown, you can further budget time and material needed throughout a season. West Milford, for instance, sees nearly double the amount of events per year than New York City. A lot of them snow showers or nickel and dime events, but there's a lot more salting apps that are going to be needed throughout the course of the winter in West Milford as opposed to Caldwell and New York City. Last but not least, snow and ice contract considerations. Let's talk about mixed precipitation types. Well, we'll start off with what are the main precipitation types that we care about. There's snow, there's sleet, and there's freezing rain. You can see an image of each of them on the left, but each require a different amount of equipment and labor, right? Sleet's a lot more dense than snow and more difficult to remove. And then freezing rain, that glare ice is kind of in its ball game of its own. Many contracts that we see include a T&M clause for ice, which is synonymous with freezing rain here, right? That glare ice on the bottom that accumulates on the tree branches. It's really, really difficult to remove. You have to, go through a whole bunch of salt just to deal with a coating or a 1/10 inch of that freezing rain ice. However, a lot of times we don't see sleet included in any kind of clauses. And in some instances, we don't see freezing rain accounted for in contracts either. So what I want to demonstrate is there is some scientific backing to approximate how much sleet or how much ice from freezing rain would equate to in snow. And it's used with an estimate that considers the average liquid water content, i.e. the density. And the rule of thumb is if you have a 1/10 inch of sleet, that equals about a 1/3 inch of snow. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio. And yes, sleet ends up being on average about 3 times more difficult, if not more, to remove than snow. Freezing rain, on the other hand, is kind of in its, like I was saying before, kind of in its league of its own. A 1/10 inch of ice equates to about 1 inch of snow. So it's about a 10-to-1 ratio when dealing with that. So how would I maybe structure a contract, or what might I want to consider when making a contract? Well, here's an example of when, let's say it snowed 3 inches of snow, 1 inch of sleet, and 0.2 inches of ice. Snow and sleet, unfortunately, are recorded as snow. That's the standard way of measuring it by the National Weather Service and pretty much any observer across the entire US. So snow and sleet will be blurred together. They will not be separated. Ice from freezing rain will be separated. So it makes ice, accounting for that, quite easy. It makes sleet a little bit more difficult. So in this example of 3 inches of snow, 1 inch of sleet, 0.2 inches of ice, here's what a certified snowfall total report might look like that we would issue after an event to help verify how much snow or ice fell. So the snow total would report as 4 inches. Again, snow and sleet would be blurred together. The ice would be reported as 0.2 inches. If you had a contract that did not account and not have a clause for mixed precipitation, you'd probably just be billing 4 inches, or maybe 4.2 inches if you added the 0.2 inches of ice on top of the 4 inches of snow. Wouldn't be very beneficial for you, and it wouldn't really account for the amount of work that you had to do in this kind of storm. So what about if you had an ice clause in your contract and accounted for that, but not for sleet? We'd still have 4 inches of snow / sleet, but then you do the conversion of 0.2 inches of ice times 10 equals 2 additional inches, and then you'd have 6 billable inches of snow, which is getting warmer and closer to the amount of work that you actually did. Now, lastly, what if you also included sleet and ice and accounted for that and did some conversions? Well, that's where you'd have 3 inches of snow plus 1 inch of sleet, which is 3 times more dense than snow. That would give you 6 inches of billable snow, plus that 2 inches of billable ice gives you 8 inches of billable snow, which is probably a lot more representative of the work that you actually did. And that can have implications on a storm-by-storm contract or even a seasonal contract. So these are just some things that you should consider when building a contract and discuss them over with your customers. Overall, what we're trying to do is build lasting relationships, not just trying to make sure it's fair for you, but also making sure that it's fair for your customers. Where does this all start? It starts at location-specific climate data, understanding that data, and then educating your customers with that data. That will help you find the right metrics for time and material. It will hopefully, in the end, make equitable billing for all parties. And kind of the side effects from all of that are trusted partnerships and longer lasting relationships. So there's sort of a cycle here. And again, it all starts with understanding this climate data and then utilizing this climate data in an effective way. So as a session recap, snowfall has and always will continue to vary from season to season. It is these ranges and extremes that make up averages. And again, probably want to use an average range as opposed to an average number, since average snowfall happens so infrequently. It's critical to your business to know what these climate numbers are. Many of us experienced a down season this past winter, particularly on the eastern half of the US. More snow will come, but as a snow contractor, last year, were you ready for that lean winter? Will you be ready in case there's another lean winter in the near future? What about the next record-setting winter, right? You have to be able to account for all of that in your contracts. And make sure that no matter how much snow falls, you're covering the cost of being ready to provide that level of service required by your contracts, right? You're not just doing work during the storm, you're doing work before, during, and after the storm and the season. From a snowfall data standpoint and climatology standpoint, quick recaps would be, well, with quality data, you can improve your overall billing model and responses to RFPs. You can calculate more appropriate caps, floors, and refunds when you set up contracts, or maybe you start restructuring contracts to account for this. You can identify snowfall trends over the short and the long term. We saw in New York City, there's been a steady increase over the last 30 years as far as the 10-year number going from roughly 20 inches per year to 40 inches per year. And you can determine a baseline or a trigger for time and material needed. And you can do that with the event magnitude breakdown that you see in the bottom of the Snowtistics report. And again, these reports are available across the entire US at a location-specific level. 5, 10, 15-year Snowtistic reports are available if you're interested. And again, WeatherWorks, we're here for you. I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that you have. You see my email there in the center of the screen, Rob Reale at WeatherWorksInc.com. And if you'd like to request a Snowtistics report, you can reach out to data@WeatherWorksInc.com. I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and thanks SIMA for allowing me to provide this tech talk to you. I hope it was informative. Everyone have a safe next couple of months, and I wish lots of snow for you in the coming winter.